In January of 1857, a 35-year-old French novelist sat in a Paris courtroom and listened to the imperial prosecutor argue for 2.5 hours that his novel, the first he had ever published, was so morally dangerous that the state of France had a duty to remove it from circulation, to fine its author, and to fine, separately, the magazine that had serialized it and the publisher who had printed it. The prosecutor, Ernest Pinard, was 34 years old. He was a rising star of the imperial legal apparatus. He would later prosecute Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal for the same crime, in the same courtroom, 6 months later. He read aloud, to the panel of 3 judges, 4 specific passages from the novel. He explained, calmly, what was wrong with each. He demanded conviction. The novelist was Gustave Flaubert. The book was Madame Bovary. And the strangest thing about the trial, the strangest thing about the entire criminal case for offense to public morals and to religion, mounted by the Second French Empire against this particular book in this particular winter, is that the book the prosecutor was reading from is, on the surface, a novel about a small-town doctor's wife in Normandy who has 2 affairs, runs up some debts, and eventually swallows arsenic. There is no explicit sex in it. There is no blasphemy. There is no political content. There is no incitement to anything. It is, to a modern reader, one of the calmest and most beautifully made novels of the 19th century. So, what was on trial? And why did the prosecutor lose? This is the story of the only obscenity trial in history that helped invent the modern novel. To understand what Pinard was prosecuting, you have to understand what Flaubert had actually done. Madame Bovary, when it appeared in Revue de Paris in 6 installments in the autumn of 1856, was instantly recognized by everyone who read it as a technical achievement of a new order. Flaubert had worked on it for 56 months. He had written, on his own account, an average of 100 words per day. He had sometimes spent an entire week on a single page. He had read every sentence aloud, in his bookline study at Croisset-on-the-Seine, in a particular kind of declamation he called the gueuloir, the yelling place. If a sentence sounded wrong, he removed it. He had crossed out, by his own count, more material than he had kept. What he had achieved was a way of writing that did something no 19th-century novelist had done before. It is now called, in literary theory, free indirect discourse. The narrator's voice and the character's voice fuse in mid-sentence so that the reader cannot tell which is speaking. The character's thoughts come at you without warning, without quotation marks, without an Emma thought. They are simply there in the prose, indistinguishable from the descriptive passages around them. Open the novel to any page. Here is Emma Bovary in Chapter 9, looking at her husband, the dull provincial doctor she married because she had no other options. The sentence is in the 3rd person. The sentence is in past tense. The sentence is, ostensibly, the narrator describing the scene. But the judgment in it, the contempt, the boredom, the despairing cruelty, is entirely Emma's. The narrator has dissolved into her consciousness without telling you. You are reading her contempt for her husband as if it were a fact in the world. This is what made the novel modern. This is also, in 1857, what made it dangerous. Pinard, the prosecutor, did not have the literary vocabulary to name what Flaubert had done. The technique was, at the time, technically nameless. But Pinard could see, with the lawyer's instinct, what the technique was doing. He told the court the following. He said that the most dangerous feature of the novel was not its content. Yes, there was an adulterous affair. Yes, there was a suicide. Yes, the characters behaved badly. Those were all normal features of 19th-century fiction. What was dangerous, he said, was that the author had refused to provide a moral commentary. He had not stepped forward at any point in the novel to condemn Emma's adultery, to condemn her vanity, to condemn her false dreaming, to condemn her terrible death. The narrator never spoke against her. The narrator never spoke for her. The narrator simply described, in the same calm, beautiful prose, her wedding cake, her bedroom curtains, her thoughts about her lover, her purchase of arsenic, her death agonies, her funeral, and the dispersal of her belongings. The novel, Pinard said, was a book without moral instruction. And a book without moral instruction, distributed to French wives and daughters, was an invitation to imitate Emma, to seek the same affairs, the same debts, the same destruction. This was the actual case. It was not, in fact, about sex. It was about technique. Pinard had understood, more clearly than most readers of his era, that Flaubert had written a kind of novel that did not need to tell the reader what to think, and Pinard was arguing, correctly, that such a novel was a new kind of object, and that it changed the relationship between fiction and morality, and that the state of France had not yet decided whether such an object should be permitted. Flaubert's defense lawyer, Marie-Antoine Jules Senard, spoke for 4.5 hours. Senard's argument was, in essence, that Pinard had completely misread the novel. He insisted that the novel was profoundly moral, that Emma's terrible death by arsenic, in Chapter 8 of Part 3, was the unmistakable judgment of the novel against her behavior. That no reader of even modest sensibility could possibly come away thinking that adultery and luxury and lying had been recommended. Senard read aloud the long passage describing Emma's 12-hour death, the black liquid coming up out of her stomach, the convulsions, the rosary the priest could not get to her in time, her last laugh, which is one of the worst paragraphs in the novel. And he asked the panel, "Does this sound like a book that recommends adultery?" This was a sound legal argument. It was not, strictly, a true literary argument. Flaubert had not, in fact, intended Emma's death as moral retribution. He had written, in his letters to his closest friend Louise Collet, that he intended the novel to be a study of human stupidity, including Emma's, but not particularly aimed at Emma, and that he held no special moral position about adultery one way or the other. He had famously said, in a letter that came out only after his death, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. He had identified with her. He had described his own labor over her death scene as so intense that he had vomited his lunch while writing it. He was, in his correspondence, almost completely amoral about the novel. He was an artist working on a particular technical problem. He was not a moralist. But Senard could not say any of this in court. He had to claim Flaubert was a moralist. He had to. The defense depended on it. He spent 4.5 hours arguing that the prosecutor had failed to recognize the moral lesson of Emma's death, that the lesson was so obvious, so painful, so visibly stamped on every page of the final third of the novel, that the prosecution itself was an embarrassment to the dignity of the imperial bench. The court adjourned. The 3 judges retired. A week later, on the 7th of February, 1857, they returned a verdict. Flaubert was acquitted. So was his publisher. So was the magazine. The judges, in their written opinion, agreed that the novel was technically magnificent. They also said, and this is the line that has been remembered, that the novel had erred on the side of vulgar and offensive realism, and that they were issuing the acquittal with formal regret, expressing the wish that the author and his publisher would, in future works, demonstrate greater regard for those principles which form the foundation of every well-ordered society. It was a moral scolding wrapped around a legal victory. Flaubert read the verdict in his hotel room. He wrote to his brother Achille that he was relieved but contemptuous. The judges, he said, were stupid. The prosecutor was stupid. The whole exercise had been stupid. He had, of course, kept every clipping of every newspaper for the next 30 years. What happened next was that Madame Bovary sold 60,000 copies in 18 months. The trial had made it famous. Every French reader who could read wanted to see the book that the imperial government had nearly banned. Critics now had to take Flaubert seriously, whether they wanted to or not. Charles Baudelaire, who would be prosecuted himself by the same Pinard 6 months later, wrote a long admiring review in which he diagnosed exactly what Flaubert had done with the narrator. Baudelaire saw the free indirect technique before anyone else, although he did not yet have a name for it. Within a decade, every serious European novelist, Tolstoy, Issa de Queyras, Henry James, eventually Joyce, had read Madame Bovary and understood that the rules of fiction had changed. The technique propagated. By the end of the 19th century, free indirect discourse had become the dominant mode of literary fiction. It is now so universal that contemporary readers do not notice it. When Tolstoy writes Anna Karenina 10 years after Bovary's trial, and gives us Anna's consciousness without saying Anna thought. That is the Flaubert technique. When Henry James writes The Portrait of a Lady, that is the Flaubert technique. When Virginia Woolf opens Mrs. Dalloway with Clarissa Dalloway's thoughts about the morning, what a lark, what a plunge, that is the Flaubert technique. When you read a modern novel that drops you straight into a character's head without a she thought tag, you are reading a sentence that was first technically constructed in a study above the Seine in 1855 by a fad-exhausted novelist with stomach pains, who would write it aloud, decide it sounded wrong, and write it again. What does this mean today? It means that the criminal prosecution of Madame Bovary in 1857 was, on the surface, an obscenity case, and underneath the surface, a struggle over a much larger question: whether fiction has the right to describe human behavior without moralizing about it. Pinard's instinct was that a novel without moral guidance was a dangerous object. He was, in a sense, correct. The novel without moral guidance, which Flaubert invented and which every subsequent novelist refined, has been one of the most disruptive forces in modern Western culture. It has taught readers to inhabit consciousnesses that are not their own. It has taught them to suspend judgment. It has taught them that to understand a human being is not, automatically, to condemn or to absolve that human being. It has expanded, by orders of magnitude, the moral imagination of literate Europe and America. This was not an accident. This was Flaubert's project. He worked on it for 56 months on a single book. He defended it in court. He won. And the book that Pinard had tried to remove from circulation went on to teach the entire modern world how to read. It is still in print. It is still translated into every major language. It is still, by the count of the modern library, and by the count of nearly every English-language literary critic of the 20th century, one of the 2 or 3 best novels ever written. It is also the only one of them whose author was put on trial for writing it, and acquitted, in part, because his lawyer had been forced to claim a moral position the author had never actually held. If this changed how you think about Madame Bovary, subscribe. We break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like. It helps the channel more than you think.